Hello and welcome to the AISA webinar. Today we are going to be focusing on well-being in international schools, strategy, engagement and practice. My name is Graham Watts. I am Director of Professional Learning at AISA, and this is...
Hi, I'm Chanel Wursteling. I'm the Child Protection and Wellbeing Program Coordinator with AISA.
Thank you, Chanel. And Chanel, thank you in particular for joining us, because you being in Brisbane, Australia, I think it's now about 2 a.m. So thank you for being awake and for being with us today. I am going to switch over to our presentation for today, whilst I'm doing that, just a reminder that there is a feature to ask questions and to post notes if you wish. You can ask questions in the chat box that is going on beside the screen. If you would like to, you're very welcome to post your name and tell us the school that you work at, and perhaps if you have a job that's related to wellbeing or child protection, you might want to tell us what the job title is too. We're expecting 177 people to join us today. Well, 177 people have registered, so we look forward to some questions as we work our way through today's agenda. The focus for today, well, it's always a challenge to try to take a big topic like well-being in the context of our international schools and turn that into something that is productive in a 60-minute slot. So today we have a focus on positive psychology in education. And looking at how positive psychology approaches and interventions and how a school-wide culture of positive psychology can create a compassionate, positive school culture. We will be looking a little bit at the school's role, the role of the school leader in creating a positive learning environment, as well as exploring some strategies, some approaches to help people who are thinking about taking some next steps after our webinar today. Okay, so as we move forward, it's always useful to help you understand a little bit about us and our journeys as educators and professionals. That has brought us to this point where we are passionate advocates for well-being in the international school context that we're working. My journey has been over the last, 26 years of teaching. I know I don't look old enough to have been teaching that long. I was an early starter. For me, the turning point was actually working at an independent school in New Zealand. It was a very prestigious, very successful school. The students got top grades and they did fantastically in sport and drama and music and just about every aspect of extracurricular that you could imagine. But what I observed was that in a place where I had expected to find a lot of happiness, in a place where I expected to observe a lot of wellness, that wasn't the case. Although the students were financially advantaged, although they came from comfortable socioeconomic backgrounds, they had teachers that knew them and cared about them, and they often went on to do very successful things at university and in careers. There were students who were unhappy, students who were very stressed, very anxious, students who had difficulty sleeping at night, students who perhaps felt they didn't fit in, and that was evidenced by self-harming, mental health episodes, and some other quite serious indicators that told me that the assumption I had made that there was a link between well-being and money is a fallacy. That's a myth. I came back to teach in the UK for New Zealand, 2007, and found myself working in a comprehensive secondary school in a very underprivileged part of town. I also observed challenges, students with challenges in terms of their well-being. There were a lot of students, I remember first thing in the morning, you could sometimes see students kicking off. Perhaps somebody would come in at the beginning of the day and say something that I considered quite minor and irrelevant compared to some of the insults that got thrown around. And suddenly a student could kick off, there could be a major fight, there'd be an incident, student was sent home for the day and they lost a day of learning. And again, it made me wonder, what are some of the issues that are going on here? What are some of the reasons that explain the anger, the anxiety, the upset that some of the students are presenting? And what is the impact that is having on some of their some of their day-to-day experiences, but also on their learning outcomes? I was in a fortunate position to work with a benefactor from the United States in setting up a children's wellbeing charity in the UK called the Goldie Hawn Foundation that I led for about 5 years. And that took a wellbeing curriculum called Mind Up to schools in across North America, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and Hong Kong. And for me, it was a fascinating journey in seeing how teachers, children, school leaders and parents can improve well-being when there is a shared understanding, when there's a shared agenda in terms of what is well-being and what can we do in those roles to improve our well-being, but also those of our children. So that's been my journey that's brought me to this point. I joined AISA 5 years ago, and I've been looking for an opportunity to focus on well-being. That's a wonderful link to Chanel, who shares my passion for well-being. Chanel, could you tell us your journey that's brought us here today?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. So for those of you perhaps who don't know, Graham and I started with AISA at the same time, and though our prior journeys to AISA are quite different, it's interesting how this passion that we both have about well-being has really led us to this point. But so before I joined AISA, my background actually wasn't in education, it was in the international development space. So for most of my career, my first my first master's was in international development, and so I was really focusing on how to improve the lives of people in really impoverished communities around the world. So I worked in Cambodia and different parts of the Pacific, a little bit in Africa even. And another one of my areas of focus was really in the child protection space. So when I began my work with AISA, actually that was one of my first conversations with my current boss, Dr. Peter Beekman, was really mindful that child protection was a big part of my background. So when the opportunity a couple of years ago came up to lead the child protection space, I really jumped at that opportunity. So I feel really fortunate to be leading the AISA's child protection agenda. So a couple of years ago, or about mid last year, I started thinking about reviewing and rewriting AISA's child protection program. And at the same time that I was doing that, I was also reading a book by Martin Seligman on Flourish. He's the father of positive psychology. I'm also studying a master's in counselling. So my head is very much in that sort of how can we improve people's functioning? How do we improve people's lives? So as I'm thinking with my child protection hat on of why is child protection an issue for all our schools? It's because we want to create safe learning environments, because it's only when children feel safe are they able to thrive? And so then that question of, well, thriving comes into it as well. Well, how do we create the optimal conditions for children to be thriving in school? So that's where I see child protection and wellbeing as really being supportive of each other and ultimately working towards the same outcome, which is to help children experience, you know, the best outcomes possible in their school life. So as I'm based in Australia, Australia is also really forward thinking in the positive education space. So I've been able to attend a couple of positive education conferences here, which really helped me in forming a clearer picture of how wellbeing can be supported in our schools. So that's a very roundabout way to how wellbeing got onto AISA's agenda. Yeah.
Wow. So yes, you're pretty busy with your studies and your work for AISA.
Lots of balls in there, lots of balls.
Indeed, indeed. So Chanel, can you start off by sharing for us what is positive psychology? What is it all about? I'm sure there've been people who are familiar with psychology and who perhaps study psychology, and there may be some psychologists, but what is the particular focus of positive psychologists?
Sure. So do you want to go to the next slide? Da, da, da. So the reason I thought it was important to start this conversation with just a general grounding or understanding of positive psychology is because it has been so influential in our understanding of well-being. So, well, what is positive psychology? Essentially, positive psychology asks the question, what makes for a good life? So I think, as I mentioned earlier, Martin Seligman, actually I have his book right here, is the father of the positive psychology movement. And for those of you who may or may not be familiar with his name, he in the early 2000s became the head of the American Psychology Association. And as the new head of that psychology association, he really asked the question, well, what makes for a good life? Psychology traditionally has focused on how do we repair, how do we heal, how do we take people who are suboptimal in their functioning, how do we address mental health challenges so that they're functional. But positive psychology says, how do we go from 0 to, you know, plus, plus, plus? What are the conditions that create well-being, that create a flourishing life? And these are questions that really have been asked since, you know, the ancient Greeks. They're not new questions, but positive psychology is a scientific study of what makes for a good life. So the emphasis of positive psychology is on flourishing. It's not just avoiding ill health. It's not just healing or addressing the deficit, but it's focused on how do we achieve optimal human functioning. It's a very strengths-based approach. So it looks at an individual's strengths and focuses on how do we build and nurture those strengths so that we become our best selves, so that we really flourish. Just one note, I think sometimes, unfortunately, in the title positive psychology, I think it can be a little bit of a misnomer, and people can mistakenly assume that we're just talking about positive emotions. And whilst positive psychology is definitely focused on how do we create the conditions of feeling and experiencing positive emotions, it by no means is saying that we should only experience positive emotions, and that positive emotions are the only good emotions. I'm putting there in air brackets. In my experience, positive psychology really recognises and indeed encourages us to get in touch with the full range of emotional experience that we have, but equips us to be able to handle those not so positive emotions, but those emotions that are really important for everyday functioning still. So I hope I've explained that okay, but we're not just talking about positive emotions when we talk about positive psychology.
That's a good point, because I think in the wellbeing space generally, we need to be aware that we as parents and as educators can't take away stresses or stressors.
Yeah.
We can't solve problems or take a student's or child's anxiety away from them. Children and indeed adults will have worries and anxieties. They may have difficulty getting to sleep. They may feel anger or nerves about speaking in public or something. And when we're talking about positive psychology and well-being generally, we are recognizing the full plethora, the full continuum of human emotion, but saying, if you don't like the way you feel, there are things that you can do about it. If you are angry and you don't want to be, if you are lying in bed at night and you can't get to sleep, there are some strategies that will help you find calm and tranquility. So that's a good point. Nobody's in a position to say we can only focus on the positive. It's about saying where are we and how can we move towards the positive.
Exactly, or that happiness is the ultimate goal. Yes, when we're talking about well-being, we're certainly talking about hopefully improving people's experience of happiness, but that's not the ultimate goal necessarily, or the focus even of well-being. So you can ask a question, Graham, to those of you who are out there listening. We just thought this might be a great opportunity for us to hear from you, and how you would define well-being, maybe in a word or in a very brief sentence. When you hear the word well-being, what does that mean for you? What words does that conjure up for you?
Yeah. Okay, so we invite you to take a moment to reflect, perhaps discuss ideas if there are other people with you, if you have colleagues around, and to post your thoughts to that question. How would you define well-being? You will probably have found the webinar chat feature. We actually have an early offering from Joanna Montfort-Torres, who is saying her understanding is a state of being at peace with yourself. That's what well-being means to Joanna. We have a lot of people posting to say where they're from. We've got people already from Lagos, Abuja, from Nairobi, and I'm sure many other cities around the continent. Healthy-minded from Shelley. I think Shelley is at ISK. So it's good to have some more ideas. Another one from Jonah saying, well-being is the condition where one has the skills and strength to problem solve, access help, and be your best self. To thrive.
To thrive, yeah.
Yeah. Martin Seligman was so wise calling it, I think his first book was Thrive and the second one was Flourish, because those words are so powerful and so succinct. And we all know as teachers and parents, we know what that looks like. They're great names. I wonder if he's going to publish a third book. What would that be called? State of satisfaction and peace. Being able to cope with emotions and calm yourself to a peaceful state. Well-being in a nutshell could mean being in a state of happiness in terms of your mental and bodily, physical happiness. and somebody from Madagascar, that was Joanna. Thank you, Joanna. And well-being is the ability to maintain mental health and thrive through a variety of life events and stressors. The ability to form healthy relationships and experience a level of accomplishment throughout life. But we should be writing these down, Chanel, and we can send them to Marty
Well,
his next book.
Well, yeah, I mean, we might jump into the next slide. I think it's, you know, it's fantastic to get those different responses because, you know, well-being, as we've just heard, it's not just one thing. It's, you know, and it is quite tricky to define because it is a construct. So Martin Seligman defines well-being as consisting of, well, in his Flourish book, he has 5 different elements that in his view make up well-being. More recently a 6th one has been added, but people talked about happiness. So yes, well-being is being able to experience positive emotions, happiness, love, joy, peace. All those positive emotions can be described as, we can describe ourselves as being in a state of well-being. I really love the second one, engagement or flow, when we're doing something we really love, we're really passionate about, that we're really great at. You know, we can find ourselves in a state of flow, in a state of just total absorption in something. So you might be a sports person, an artist, a musician, reading a book, a writer, or could be any number of, doing math, even if that's what you love, math, science, whatever it is. But being able to experience that real engagement and joy of being absorbed in a task. Meaning and purpose, I think, is another huge one. We know that to live a good life, we need a life of purpose. We need a life of meaning. We need to feel that we're part of something or contributing something that's bigger than ourselves. And I think, Graham, your first example of being at a school where kids perhaps had every financial benefit, you know, is not always necessarily going to lead to well-being, because I think that aspect of meaning and purpose is so important. Someone mentioned accomplishment or achievement, or being competent, being able to master something, being able to experience feeling like you're good at something. I think that's really important. And so someone else mentioned positive relationships, connection, feeling like you're able to connect with people, you're able to experience relationships that are fulfilling, that are caring, that are nurturing, is so important for well-being. And we know that loneliness is a huge issue. Even for kids in our socially connected world, we can still feel a sense of social isolation. So we all need to feel connected to others.
Just cutting in there, Chanel, I think that's also particularly pertinent in international school communities.
Yes.
Because students can leave on a Monday, and a few weeks later they're at a different school. They may be the only person who's new that day, and they not only have lost their school friends, but also their wider peer network, the extended family.
Yeah, exactly. In my experience, I think a lot international schools do a great job in perhaps more so than schools, you know, regular schools, in creating communities of connections for that very reason, because and recognizing that we can't thrive, we can't flourish if we're not grounded in a sense of community with other people, in a sense of connectedness, which is so important that we're creating that in our classrooms, a sense of respecting each other, all those different things. So So hugely important. And of course, health. I mean, we can't thrive or flourish if our physical health is compromised. So it's really important to think about things like our sleep, our nutrition, of balancing. And again, this is so important in the international school context that can be very academically driven and driven towards the next test, the next assignments, which can, you know, cause all sorts of craziness for students. So really being mindful of taking care of our physical health is also really important. So as you can see, that's a lot of different dimensions that that are at play when we're talking about well-being. That's a lot of different balls in the air. There's a lot of different things to be getting right all at once as well. So yep, so we can talk a little bit about that later.
But in some ways, that nicely illustrates the complexity involved with any discussion around well-being. It's not as simple as perhaps developing a new literacy approach where we know there is a correct outcome that we're looking for, and we know the most effective pedagogy to get there, most effective parenting skill.
Exactly, and it's a really helpful framework when thinking about well-being, to think, well, there are all these many different dimensions of well-being. So yeah, anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Okay, so why is it a school's role to be involved in well-being? I guess before I hand over to Chanel, I guess from my own experience, one of the learnings in my 26 years of teaching has been a journey that many of us as teachers have gone through, where once upon a time, if there was a student who was unhappy or perhaps experiencing something more serious, somebody who had a mental health episode, then they were often kind of farmed out. They would be working with the counsellor, or in some cases they'd be working perhaps not even at school, they'd be working with a healthcare professional in an off-site facility. I think part of our appreciation of well-being is the shift from intervention towards prevention. And rather than talking about well-being when there's an absence of it, rather than waiting till there being a problem and needing an intervention, which often takes people out of some of the school contexts in order to find the right clinical specialist. I think part of the reason this is becoming something that is so widely talked about in schools is that we realise now that the focus should be, as well as on interventions for the individuals who need it, but we should also be focusing on the prevention. And the prevention is something that every child, young person, indeed adult has an entitlement to. So I think really from many teachers' point of view, particularly old people like me who've been teaching for many years, will see that that's a journey that we have been on as a profession, realising that we have a role in well-being much earlier on than perhaps we had appreciated.
Exactly, Graham. I think, and this slide has some pretty startling statistics up there. But globally, we're seeing that 10 to 20% of children and adolescents experience a mental health disorder. And when we're talking about a mental health disorder, we're talking about, you know, something that is diagnosable. So these are children that are experiencing, you know, quite severe impediments to their functioning, and so that's a huge percentage. We know that depression is on the rise globally, that youth suicide is a problem in just about every society. And we know too that if mental health issues aren't addressed in early childhood or adolescence, that we're far more likely to experience mental health issues as adults if they're not addressed, which really impairs and limits your human functioning. So exactly. So what, I mean, we started this discussion by thinking about, well, why is wellbeing so important for schools? And as you said, Graham, it's important because schools can play such a critical, proactive role in bolstering the well-being of all of its students, so that hopefully they don't experience those severe mental health issues, that we're equipping students, you know, we're giving them tools and skills that will be preventative. So yeah.
So what is
Yeah,
this?
so I mean,
What does this look like in schools? How does this present? What are some of the things that we might observe?
yeah, so and look, I know there are some counsellors in this chat now. So and as we're seeing rise, and as you've talked about, Graham, that in your experience as a teacher, that we are seeing, you know, more and more students, you know, really struggling with issues of anxiety, depression, and at a more extreme end, self-harm, body dysmorphia or body image issues, substance abuse, poor self-esteem. And so well-being, you know, really becomes everyone's business, not just the counsellor, really. I think certainly counsellors have a huge role to play in supporting students, but it really um, is so much more impactful and effective if we can have everyone at the school with a focusing on improving and supporting mental health.
And actually, on that note, Chanel, just a message posted from Jonah saying, we've been intentionally integrating mental health conversations into our wellbeing program to normalise talking about mental health issues.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great comment, and really, really awesome to hear that that's happening in schools.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Having conversations, giving students even the vocabulary as well as the permission to talk about mental health issues before it becomes something that may need a more serious intervention.
Yeah.
So in terms of developing the whole child, one of the aspects of positive psychology has been some of the curricula that have been developed in recent years that have looked at how we can develop a culture of positive psychology, what the role of the school leader might be, as well as how we can teach aspects of positive psychology to children and young people. Chanel, did you want to talk a little bit about that, or then I'll give some examples in a moment or two?
Yeah, well, I think in a lot of our schools we're seeing that academic success is just one measure of success. That more and more schools are really recognising that success, whilst academic success is important, but we're wanting children to be successful after they leave school as well. So we're wanting children to be able to know how to problem solve, to know how to resolve conflict, to be able to set goals, to have compassion for people, to be able to manage their emotions, to be engaged in their communities, to be committed to their communities, and all those different aspects of living life, of what it is to be human. And so I think schools are more and more broadening their education agenda to encompass those soft skills of education, if you like.
I recently heard at a prize giving at the end of school year, a head teacher giving out awards for some of those soft skills, the awards for kindness and showing empathy, for savouring happiness, and it was summed up beautifully when the head teacher said that the school's commitment and her commitment to her students went beyond their last test or their last exam. It
Yeah.
goes that the commitment she was talking about was the commitment to the kids' well-being, the social emotional wellness after they've left school, as they head on to further study or out into the world as learners and adults later. And I thought that's a nice illustration of how a school is changing its remit a little bit from being an exam factory that schools have been under pressure to be for many years, towards recognising the child as a whole, but also recognising, and I know you're going to talk about this a bit later, but also looking at the research that has linked students' well-being with academic success.
Yeah, and I love that schools are recognising that those values like kindness, like being compassionate or being a leader are just as valuable and worthy of merit as being the best at math or being, getting the science award. And I think it's so important for schools to start communicating that in different ways, that those things are a great value, and that therefore we should be nurturing those things.
In fact, I think the next wave of PISA tests, as well as looking at attainment in language, arts, maths and science, are also going to start to assess students' ability in what are sometimes called soft skills, problem-solving skills, decision-making skills, ability to understand an issue from a variety or diverse range of perspectives. It's great to see those being included. Sadly, I read in the UK that the Department for Education in my home country is not going to be taking part in those, but I think that shows how slow sometimes government policy is to catch up, and perhaps just a reminder of some of the freedoms and opportunities we have in the international school sector to focus on the whole child.
Yeah.
Let me move forward. So the evidence.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned in my intro that I'm also doing a master's in counselling. So, so we're very much trained to be evidence-based practitioners. That anything that we do in the mental health space is, of course, supported by evidence. Does this work? Is this intervention? Is it proven to actually support people's mental health?
It's the same in teaching.
Same in teaching. Well, exactly, and so the positive psychology movement has been and positive psychology and positive education movement has been very intentional about ensuring that it is gathering evidence to support that these interventions are impactful for students from both an academic point of view and a student's wellbeing point of view. So there's a growing body of literature. I've listed a couple of reports there, but there's heaps and heaps out there. I'm happy to share anything if anyone wants to contact me later on. But just to say that it is that we're not just talking about interventions that we think are a good idea, but we're really wanting to ensure that that these interventions that we're talking about do have evidence to support the fact that they do work, that they are impactful. And just a very brief to that end, this thinking has really helped inform AISA's research school approach, because and Graham and I won't spend a lot of time talking about that now, but we as AISA is going forward in its wellbeing initiative, we want to also be sure that we're gathering evidence to support the initiatives that schools are implementing. So so we're part of this movement as well.
One of the studies that I remember shaping the agenda when I was working for a wellbeing charity was the work by Professor Kimberly Schönert-Reichel at the University of British Columbia, who did a multi-strand RCT looking at well, several aspects, looking at pro-social behaviours, kids' ability to improve their interaction with others, looking at academic attainment. She was looking specifically at mathematics, and also looking at kids reporting improved happiness. It was fascinating that in all three of those aspects she found positive results. I was really interested in why she looked at maths as opposed to language arts, but it comes back to the neuroscience or the neurobiology of the brain. Mathematical problem solving takes place in the prefrontal cortex. I've got a perfect head to talk about the brain. I had the light on, you could see the different parts. So mathematical problem solving takes place here in the prefrontal cortex. This is where we also we metacogitate. This is where our aesthetic judgment,
executive functioning,
executive function, that's the word I'm looking for. And of course, when we are stressed or anxious, the amygdala hijacks the activity from the prefrontal cortex and keeps us ruminating in that area of worrying. You know, and we've all been in that situation where we've, you know, I'm always one, I can think of the right thing to say the day after I needed to say it. And then the conversation goes around through my mind 10, 20, 30 times. And that's when I'm emotionally hijacked or flooded by the amygdala. And in terms of kids learning, when kids are stressed or anxious, it slows down the brain functioning of the prefrontal cortex. So mathematical problem solving would expect to be slowed and less accurate. And that was what Kimberly Schönert-Reichel found in her studies, that there is a link between improving kids' well-being and academic attainment, although that was looking at maths with 13-year-olds. I found that an interesting study. Okay, so back to you. And your invitation to tell us, is your school doing something in the social emotional learning or the CEL area or the wellbeing space? We're interested just to see a show, well, not show of hands because you can't do that effectively here, but a yes or a no, just to see how many schools have something in place already. Would be a yes. No would be for the schools who are here because they're interested in taking their first steps. And that's something we will come back to visit a little bit later. So what are some of the most effective strategies? How might this work in your classroom, or how might it work across the school? Chanel's going to talk a little bit about some of the big picture ideas, and then from my work as a teacher and also working in a wellbeing charity, I want to share some examples of lessons or parts of lessons that I have found particularly effective.
Yeah, so positive education is basically an approach that combines academic learning with character and well-being. So, and integrates that throughout the entire curriculum. So, whilst traditionally perhaps we've thought of social and emotional learning in a particular class, maybe you have one social and emotional learning class a week. I think what we're beginning to see more and more is social and emotional learning embedded in the curriculum, in math, in history, in science, in PE, that we have teachers that are thinking, how can this lesson potentially relate to our social emotional learning objectives as well. But having said that, there are also one-off interventions that are specifically targeting specific areas of dimensions of flourishing that we referenced at the start. So Martin Seligman's PERMA model of the positive emotions, or the relationship building, or the sense of accomplishment and achievement. So did you want to speak to this next part of the slide, Graham? Or
yeah, sure. I'm just looking at the feedback that we're getting. Lots of people saying yes, they are. Some people saying they'd like to do more. Saying some people have started focusing on teacher well-being before they move on to students, which I know, Chanel, is something you're going to come to talk about a little bit later. And that ties in with something that Shelley posted a little bit earlier, talking about needing to focus on the adults in the classroom as well as the children. Yes, we want to do more. We've started discussing well-being. First, training teachers to understand what it is, both in and out of the classroom, absolutely. And somebody mentioning yoga as a way of achieving physical fitness, but also yoga. I know you do a lot of yoga, Chanel. You can talk to this more than me. But also yoga's role in, well, it's a mindful activity, helping us find calm and focus and peace. Other schools talking about, we've done so much that people, one school saying they've worked with parents, staff, teachers, and now they're engaging with children. So I know that's where you're going to head off to at the end. I just want to share a couple just from some of these big ideas. For those schools who are thinking about exploring positive psychology or looking for a way of introducing positive education, there are lots of different curricula already written, very good curriculum. The place I would recommend you go to is an organisation called CASEL, which is CASEL, which is the Collaborative Alliance for Social and Emotional Learning, I think, based in the US. They have done something that's very, very useful for teachers. They have evaluated the efficacy of the many different programs that are out there, and they only endorse programs that have some external evaluation that shows that the program does achieve what it says it will. Having worked for charity that got our curriculum endorsed by CASEL, I know that they are very, very rigorous. The process took 2 years. They wanted to speak to the independent university evaluators who had researched the program that I was working on. And CASEL also organised them into different age ranges. They talk about whether it's just for children, whether there's applications for parents. So CASEL is a great resource for people who are thinking about, well, where do I go to find a curriculum that has some efficacy? For people who perhaps want to look in the UK, the Anna Freud Centre, they do something very similar, and Young Minds charity in the UK, they also do something similar. They tend to look at a curriculum that have been published in the UK. CASEL is mostly American, but also some internationally published, some curricula published by organisations outside of the US. Just looking at this wee list, one of the aspects of teaching positive psychology I found fascinating was gratitude. I remember working with a group of 11-year-olds towards the end of a lesson, and we were going to do a gratitude circle. I was going to invite everyone to stand, and I had a talking stick, and we were going to pass it around, and I was going to invite everyone to finish the sentence, "Today I am grateful for." If students wanted to pass, they could pass. If students wanted to say it silently to themselves, they could do. And we launched into this, and the first student said, "Oh, I'm grateful for my Nintendo." Somebody else said, "I'm grateful for my bike." And of course, it's not my place to place judgment, but it made me realize that the kids in the room thought gratitude was for things that were expensive and things that were bought for them. So the next lesson, I spent some time unpacking what we could be grateful for, and asking them, who made your lunch for you today? Who helped you with your breakfast? Has anybody lent you anything today? Has somebody held a door open for you today? Who has smiled at you today? and helping kids understand that we can be grateful for things that are free, things that happen quite spontaneously, things that can happen throughout the typical school day. And when we replayed the gratitude circle, we had kids saying things that were perhaps a wee bit more every day than being given a bike or a computer game. Excuse me.
I think, you know, the gratitude one is just such a great example as well, because it also helps us be intentional about focusing on the positive emotions, the positive people and things that we have in our life. And you know, so often for some reasons our tricky brains are wired for the negative often. And so I think developing a practice of gratitude just helps remind us of all the positive, you know, people and things that we actually have in our life. It can just help switch our attention and God, that's right, I have so much to be grateful for, I have so much to be thankful for. And so, you know, gratitude is important on so many dimensions. I mean, look, I've just listed a really short sort of group of activities or things that schools could be doing to help cultivate things like gratitude or goal setting or hope or calm, such as mindfulness or yoga, or developing resiliency. And there are different curriculums or activities out there to do that. But and all these things are evidence-based. They are very much supported by the evidence that says doing these things will improve students' well-being. But interventions done in isolation are less effective. So I don't want to talk too much about this, other than just to reference the fact that when we are examining the evidence is saying that doing these discrete activities as a one-off, whilst it may have an immediate benefit, it's not necessarily a benefit that will be present in the longer term. So when we're talking, that's why when we're talking about wellbeing, we are talking about what we call a whole school approach that is it's long term in its thinking. Like, so a school developing an approach from, you know, pre-K right through to high school, that it's something that's integrated throughout the entire school experience, and that it's reinforced throughout the school life. You know, we're not talking about this is just stuff that you do in the elementary years, that it's something that we continue to build on skills in an age appropriate way. And again, as we've referenced briefly, that it can be so much more impactful when the whole school community is involved. And it's really encouraging to hear that lots of our schools here are already taking that approach, that they're being purposeful about training all their teachers. And I'd say, you know, everyone from librarians to the PE coach to the science lab to the, you know, admin person in the front desk, that everyone has an understanding of how the brain works and what well-being is.
Actually, when I used to work with schools regularly, leading a day or two on well-being, I always started with the neurobiology of the brain. And just to reinforce what you're saying, of course, if we want to develop a habit, we have to repeat the activity, and it needs to be intentional, which is why, for example, now we used to talk about random acts of kindness. There was many years ago, I remember I was living in central London, there was a campaign in November on one of the tube lines, underground lines, a campaign for random acts of kindness, which I always thought was a little bit strange, because one person's random act of kindness is another person's harassment case. But a random act of kindness is a lovely thing to do. But if we plan and perhaps review, God, I'm such a teacher, but I mean talk about afterwards. That's how acting an act of kindness can become a habit rather than something that may be a one-off.
Yeah.
Chanel, I just want to share some of the messages that are coming in, people telling us what they are doing. Shelley, again, ISK, says, Castle is amazing and free. We've been using this to audit our current program. Jonah says that he's interested to learn more about what schools are doing to support teacher well-being. So I'm going to shut up in a minute because I know you're coming to that. Juanita at Kicks is talking about they've introduced yoga and mindfulness. Excuse me. Including the very popular mindfulness-based stress reduction course, MBSR, which you can do online.
Wow,
you don't need
awesome.
to. Yeah, that's a really good starting point for teachers. And they have set up a wellbeing team. They've used the Warwick Edinburgh University's mental health wellbeing scale that has norms, I think, certainly for the UK, maybe also for the US. And lots of work going on there. She's in year 5, I think, but lots of daily yoga and mindfulness, weekly target settings for year 5s. Wow, lots of really interesting stuff going on there. So let's move forward as time is running out.
So let's skip this. I think we've talked about this enough. Let's go to the teachers. So I'm so glad that so many of you have talked about the fact that teachers are important, and certainly that's definitely AISA's approach, and Graham and I certainly sort of advocating that it has to start with teachers, that as we have here, Teachers Matter. I think you know, teaching is one of the most stressful professions in the world. You know, I don't sort of, I'm sure I'm talking to the converted when I say that, but it is just such a stressful thing. And so when we're talking about well-being, we certainly don't want well-being to be yet another initiative, yet another burden, and yet another task that teachers are having to take on. But rather, when we're talking about well-being in schools, we are very much advocating that that it starts with teachers, and that school culture is so influential and impactful on the well-being of everyone, including the students, obviously. So do you want to go to the next slide, Graham? And so why do teachers matter so much? Because values are caught and taught, because teachers have such a massive role in modelling well-being, in modelling those different aspects of well-being that we talked about, of positive relationships, positive emotions, in being able to deal with stress, in being able to you know, manage their own emotions, but also in creating a pro-social classroom, in creating an environment that is supportive of students exploring and learning and being curious. And that I read something the other day, learning is vulnerability. And I thought that was just such a great saying, because learning requires us to be extremely vulnerable. It requires us to be risk takers. It requires us to make mistakes. It requires us to be curious, to get things wrong. And so if we don't have a classroom that's supportive of each other, that's nurturing positive relationships, respect, that's you know, that it's okay to fail, and all those different things, we're going to limit that learning environment. I feel like, gosh, we've had 2 minutes to talk about this, but what are different ways that that schools can support the well-being of teachers? I think there are lots of different ways, things like yoga, meditation, providing coaching for teachers, providing support for new teachers, in the research I've read, another huge factor for supporting the wellbeing of teachers is that teachers feel that they have self-efficacy, that they can make decisions, that they can take leadership in what they're doing. So, which is why school culture becomes so important, because school culture, creates those conditions.
I think one of the key starting points for a whole school culture of well-being is having a culture where teachers can openly and freely talk about how they are feeling, saying this is stressing me out, or I am stressed this week because of X, Y, and Z, whether that's school-based or home-based. It has to be a culture where people can talk about how they are feeling, rather than them just being expected to arrive at school, leave their emotions on the gate and get on with the job. That simply doesn't work. That doesn't fit the nature of human existence. So it's about having a culture where people can talk about well-being, talk about some of the challenges and some of the stressors, and also for schools to recognise how they can help teachers thrive and flourish and possibly stay longer at the school and be more productive, and all of those types of things that everyone's looking for. Chanel, I know you want to remind us about the next webinar, and then I will speak about the webinars after that.
Yeah, so the next webinar is actually on the AISA Wellbeing Research Initiative, the AISA Research Schools, and we're really inviting schools who are wanting to explore wellbeing to join with AISA in this really exciting initiative. And we're hoping that schools, what we're asking schools essentially is to commit to a wellbeing initiative, and it could be for teachers. It doesn't necessarily have to be for students. So the next webinar is going to really unpack what that initiative is. So that's on Thursday, February 6th.
Thursday the 6th of February, we'll be looking specifically at the AISA Research Initiative. I know lots of schools have already signed up to be part of it, but this is, and the people who are at the conference may already have spoken to us about this when we saw them in November, but we didn't want people who weren't at the AISA conference to miss out. So this will cover some of the same ground. And our future webinars, Chanel and I today have looked at some of the big picture. Future webinars will drill down and be more granular. We'll have a future webinar looking at wellbeing for teachers, another one looking at well-being in the classroom and some of the questions around selecting curriculum, teaching learning strategies, and we will have a final webinar, further webinar looking at how we can communicate the wellbeing agenda to our parent community. Because if we're serious about well-being, we need to be talking to parents as well as to our colleagues and the students that we work with. Okay, so that is the end of our time today. Oh, that's lovely. Somebody says you two are amazing. Okay, so today's webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on the AISA website. You and Chanel and I are also, looks like a rogues gallery. You'll also find us listed on the website. And if you have any questions, you'd like some of the PowerPoint slides, you'd like to talk about CASEL or choosing a curriculum or any of those aspects, you're very, very welcome to email us. We look forward to seeing some of you again on the next webinar on February the 6th, or joining us in some of our more focused topic-specific webinars coming up later this year. So thank you all very, very much for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar.
Thanks everyone, cheers.
Thank you everyone. Chanel, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye.